Hello again and welcome back to reading Pride and Prejudice. Boop, 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 boop. And the who we've got here today, it's Miss Jane Austen. So cute. And it's like a really firm doll, you know? It's not like flipsy flopsy, even though that did look... I am interested in crocheting. I think that would be fun. I also know that I have nothing like interesting or intelligent or new to add to this conversation around Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice and her writing and reading. And I'm just happy to learn. And I hope one day this becomes more of an interactive thing with people who are watching, you know, if that's the destiny of it all. But I think just reading out loud and getting your little whistle wet around reading and thinking about what you're reading, I think the most that I've had to offer is like, that's interesting, but I'm going to carry on and continue on. And I think it's just fun for me. So here we go. I've got my looking up tools and I've got my paper, all of my colors with all my notes on them, all the words that I've had to look up. That's looks like chaos now that I look at it out loud. And I do still have Michaelmas on there in September. I think that'll be fun to do something to celebrate the harvest. And yeah, let's carry on. XL IV 44. Yes, 10 minus 50. 1 minus 5, right. We're at Pemberley and Elizabeth is going to meet Miss Darcy, Georgiana Darcy, and tensions do be high. Tensions are high with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, because he's like, you got my letter? Did you read it? I still love you. Do you love me? I do love the last chapter, was it? Where we were just like analyzing Elizabeth's parents' marriage. That was like really odd to me, because conjugal to me means like conjugal visits, which I guess could just mean like an obligatory visit to your spouse, but people are like, it's a conjugal because we be doing it. Conjugal. Let's just look up that word. Conjugal means relating to marriage or married people. It doesn't have anything to do with banging, but conjugal visits end up being banging. I see, we've just ruined the word. I get it. Chapter 44. Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn the whole of that morning. Not to be out of sight of the inn. But her conclusion was false, for on that very morning after their arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends. Who are these new friends? Like just people they met at the inn? And were just returning to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, whoever they were, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window. Ooh. And they saw a gentleman and a lady in a curricle driving up the street. We know what a curricle is because we looked it up. Elizabeth, immediately recognizing the livery, guessed what it meant and imparted no small degree of her surprise to her relations by acquainting them with the honor which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened them to a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they felt that there was no other way of accounting for such attentions from such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. They're catching on. This boy likes their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was at every moment increasing. The perturbations. Ooh. The perturbations of Elizabeth's feelings was as of every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure. Get yourself together, Elizabeth! But amongst other causes of disquiet, she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favour, and more than commonly anxious to please, she naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. Oh my God. He's said a lot about her, maybe, to Miss Georgiana Darcy. And she just can't live up to it, she thinks. And every power of pleasing would fail her. Oh, I don't like that feeling. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen. Everybody else is still at the window. And as she walked up and down the room, oh my God, endeavoring to compose herself, oh my God, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. They're like, girl, are you okay? They're like watching her go back and forth. She's like manic. Elizabeth, calm down. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment, did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud. Everybody's proud. Everybody's prejudiced. But the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy, just like Jane. Okay, now I'm beginning to think, like, Darcy's shy, Miss Darcy's shy, Elizabeth isn't, Jane is shy, and I don't know, there's just something to that, like Mr. Darcy saw in Jane what he sees in her sister and doesn't want Mr. Bingley. I don't know. She's exceedingly shy, just like Jane. But you love your sister, but Jane wasn't good enough for your friend. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. A monosyllabic person. Miss Darcy was tall and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed, and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humour in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Such a good dating, put that on Grindr, you know? Elizabeth, who had expected to find her in her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. They had not long been together before Mr. Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, thank goodness. But had she still felt any, it could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. Cute. He inquired in a friendly, though general way after her family. Okay, you didn't ask about Jane, but fine. And looked and spoke with the same good-humoured ease that he had ever done. Oh, Mr. Bingley, a breath of fresh air, huh? To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him, the whole party before them, indeed, excited and a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observations toward each with an honest though guarded inquiry. They're watching and wanting to be matchmaker. And they soon drew from those inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Oh. Of the ladies' sensations, they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Just like Jane and Bingley, they're noticing the same thing about Darcy and Elizabeth. I don't know if there's any discourse around that idea, but that's interesting to me. It's very interesting. Elizabeth, on her side, had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose on her and to make herself agreeable to all. And in the latter object, where she feared most to fail, she was most sure of success, for those to whom she endeavoured to give pleasure were predisposed in her favour. Bingley was ready, Georgiana was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. This sounds delightful. With Jane out of the picture, and like it's just Elizabeth observing these friendly people. This is great. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to his sister. And oh, how ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed in a like manner. Just tell me if you still like her. Is there any hope for my poor sister? Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less than on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that as long as he looked at her, he was trying to trace a resemblance. But though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behaviour to Miss Darcy, who had been set up as a rival to Jane. Ooh. No look appeared on either side that spoke particular regard. Mr. Bingley and Miss Darcy don't seem to really like each other very much, is what I'm getting from this. Right. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. Right. I mean, she's so young. Miss Darcy, what is she now? I can't remember. 16 or something? That's weird. I mean, it probably wasn't back then, but like, Jane's a mature woman. And right. On this point, she was soon satisfied, and 2 or 3 little circumstances occurred ere that parted, which, in her anxious interpretation, denoted a recollection of Jane not untinctured by tenderness, and a wish of saying more that led to the mention of her, had he dared. He observed to her at the moment when the others were talking together, in a tone which had something of real regret, that it was a very long time since he had the pleasure of seeing her, and before she could reply, he added, "It is above 8 months, or we have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." I love that part because it feels very, not to just keep bringing up, like, diagnoses of fictional characters, but it feels very much like, I haven't seen you since the 26th of November on 8:02 p.m. when we were talking about this subject. Is like a very good recall. Very good recall, Mr. Bingley. And she's like, yeah, I guess it was November 26th. Exactly that date. It's like spring or something. Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact. And he afterwards took occasion to ask her, when unattended to by any of the rest, whether all her sisters were at Longbourn. Ooh, maybe he suspected that she was in London, Jane. Interesting. There was not much in the question, nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. He's trying to suss out something. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general complacence. And in all that he said, she heard an accent so removed from the hauteur or disdain of his companions as convinced her that the improvement of manners which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, had at least outlived one day. He's been polite yesterday and today, and she just really has misunderstood him. She's finding out. You just need more time to get to know people. When she saw him thus, seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion with whom any intercourse of few months ago would have been a disgrace, she thinks. When she saw him thus civil, when she saw him thus civil, not only to herself, but to the very relations whom he had openly disdained, and recollected their last lively scene in Hunsford Parsonage, the change was so great, and struck so forcibly on her mind, that she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. She's just sitting there like, watching this conversation. Would be funny. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield or his dignified relations at Rosings, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-consequence or unbending reserve, as now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavours, and when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attentions were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies both of Netherfield and Rosings. Never in my wildest dreams could I ever dream up these words in this order to mean these things. It's so wordy and chunky, and the sentences are so long, and it's really blowing my mind away. And it's really, really, I mean, obviously it's really, really good, but it's just like, wow. Maybe our way of speaking now is just so dumbed down. I mean, obviously we're texting language is awful. We're just using acronyms, which I hate acronyms in general. But like a TBH, I just this is a lot. I feel like this book nowadays would be like that big. He liked her, she didn't like him, it's just, I don't know. That was a really long sentence, and it just said so much. They were so chunky. It was so chunky. Sorry, I just had to say that. Never in my dizziest daydreams could I ever. I mean, writing would be an interesting endeavor. Their visitor stayed with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. Miss Darcy, though with a difference which marked her a little in the habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she, whom the invitation most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance, but Elizabeth had turned her head away again. No, don't. Presuming, however, that this studied avoidance spoke rather a momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on, their having dinner at Pemberley. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having a great deal to say to her and many inquiries to make after their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, construing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as some I'm having a stroke. As well as some others, found herself, when their visitors left, capable of considering the last half hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had been little. Eager to be alone and fearful of inquiries or hints from her uncle and aunt, she stayed with them only long enough to hear their favourable opinion of Bingley, and then hurried away to dress. I don't want to talk about it. Okay. But she had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. Nice. I like that. I do like not a forced conversation sometimes. It's nice to just be in thought for a little bit. It was evident that she was much better acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they had before any idea of. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw much to interest, but nothing to justify inquiry. Of Mr. Darcy, it was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report, oh my gosh, yeah, Mrs. Reynolds. If I ever need a reference, if I ever need a reference for employment, I will be going to her. This housekeeper, golly, without any reference to any other account, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known would not have recognized it for Mr. Darcy. Right, they're like, are you talking about the same Mr. Darcy? There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and soon became sensible that the authority of a servant, who had known him since he was 4 years old, and whose own manners indicated respectability. Yeah, she wasn't like super rude and then like, he's the best and you're an idiot, was not to be hastily rejected. Right, you gotta trust those, trust the housekeepers. I always say, my housekeepers are the best. I don't even know, do I know anybody with that? No, I don't know anybody with a housekeeper. I know people who like hire maids to come over and clean, but they like have to clean before the maid comes over. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of the Lambton friends that could materially lessen its weight. They had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man and did much good among the poor. That's sweet. He's charitable. With respect to Wickham, the travellers soon found out that he was not held there in much estimation. For though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were perfectly understood, it was yet a well-known fact that, on his quitting Derbyshire, he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. Mr. Darcy took care of Wickham's debts that he was pooping around the country. My gosh. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, though as it passed it seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feelings towards one in the mansion. And she lay awake 2 whole hours endeavouring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him. No, hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly omitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feeling. It's a great word. And it was now heightened into somewhat a friendlier nature by the testimony so highly in his favour, and bringing forward his disposition in so amiable a light, which yesterday had produced. Yeah, can you imagine proposing to somebody, them telling you, you're probably the worst man and I would never, ever marry you, and then, like, giving them a letter and then seeing them just pop over to your house, and you're like, I get it. I'll be nice to you. Especially from this guy who they thought was, like, the worst person in the world. It'll change your opinion of somebody. It sure will. But above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Jane Austen, Jane, we need more gratitude. It's gratitude. Thank you, Jane. Be grateful. Gratitude was not merely having once loved her. Gratitude, not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. Sometimes it's like, you just didn't know, and now you do, and what do you think now? That's not really me. Actually, that's not me. I'm not going to be mad at that. Good for him. He who she had been persuaded would avoid her as his greatest enemy. Because he did say, my opinion once lost is lost forever. He did say that. So she's like, I just thought that he would hate me forever now. He who she had been persuaded would avoid her as his greatest enemy seemed on this accidental meeting most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard or any peculiarity of manner, were where their two selves only were concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends, and bent on making her known to his sister. Such a change in a man of so much pride, exciting not only astonishment but gratitude, for to love, ardent love, it must be attributed, and as such its impressions on her was a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him, she felt a real interest in his welfare. You do, I get it. And she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power which her fancy told her she still possessed of bringing on the renewal of his addresses. It had been settled in the evening between the aunt and the niece that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's in coming to see them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only at to a late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled, by some exertion of politeness on their side, and consequently that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were therefore to go. They were therefore to go. I did underline this last time I read it because it's like the shortest sentence in this whole book. Like, they were therefore to go. And that's that. No semicolon, no comma, no nothing. No, there actually are two commas in this sentence. They were, comma, therefore, comma, to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say in reply. Mr. Gardiner left them soon after breakfast. The fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement of his meeting some of the gentlemen at Pemberley before noon. Wonderful, darlings. I shall continue on. Yes, I shall. Chapter XLV, Chapter 45. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, because Miss Bingley did be wanting Mr. Darcy. Whoa. You're so conniving, Jane. This is... Yeah. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how unwelcome her appearance at Pemberley must be to her, and was curious to know with how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. On reaching the house, they were shown through the hall into the saloon, whose northern aspects rendered it delightful for summer. Tell us more about the view. Its windows, opening to the ground, admitted a most refreshing view of the high woody hills behind the house, and of the beautiful oaks and Spanish chestnuts which were scattered over the intermediate lawn. I love it. I love the illustration of that. Not just chestnuts, but Spanish chestnuts. We're very into the woods around Pemberley. It's really beautiful to me. High on a hill with a lonely gotta lay her. Oh, high woody hills. That's what it reminded me of. High woody hills behind the house. In this house they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom she lived in London. Georgiana's reception of them was very civil, but attended with all the embarrassment which, though proceeding from shyness and the fear of doing wrong, would easily give to those who felt themselves inferior the belief of her being proud and reserved. So shy, I'm afraid to do anything wrong, and this is obviously going to play into me being proud and reserved. Golly. Mrs. Gardiner and her niece, however, did her justice and pitied her. By Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, they were not noticed only by a curtsy. They were noticed only by a curtsy, and on their being seated, a pause, awkward as such pauses must always be, succeeded for a few moments. It was first broken by Mrs. Annesley, a genteel, agreeable-looking woman whose endeavour to introduce some kind of discourse proved her to be more truly well-bred than either of the others, and between her and Mrs. Gardiner, with occasional help from Elizabeth, the conversation was carried on. Nobody wanted to talk. Miss Darcy is so shy, and the Bingleys and Mrs. Hurst are ugly people. Miss Darcy looked as if she wished for courage enough to join in it. Oh, Miss Darcy. And sometimes did venture a short sentence when there was least danger of its being heard. That's tough. Just being out in society, like, I'm just a woman. I don't know any opinions. I am reading right now. I'm listening to My Brilliant Friend, and it is just so painful to hear. I watched the first 3 seasons, and just 2 girls who grow up together and who are just in such deep competition with one another and know they have to get out of this neighborhood. And one is really smart, but can't have a thought of her own, which I super identify with. I'm just like parroting things, and she thinks she's doing good in writing these things, and then her friend is like super duper smart but can't get out, didn't have the opportunity. And just the competition there, and just being out in society, and like just practicing like speaking up, but you're like, I'm gonna do it when like pretty much nobody's gonna hear this. Ugh, it's really difficult when you just think one way about yourself and how you're going to be perceived. And some people just naturally have this ability to say, this is who I am, and say things that they think, and they just think up things. And I probably have spent most of my life just like parroting people and like, oh, that sounds cool. I'll repeat that to people to make them think I'm smart or something. It's just really hard getting out there. And I'm 40, I'm going to be 40, and it's like, I'm still kind of in my own little way dealing with this. So just like have confidence to just, think about what you want to say and say it. But then, it's very important to say things in a certain way so that people understand you and hear you. It's just, this age especially is just so hard. But she's so young. How old is it? She cannot be any more than 16 or 17. So young. You're just trying things on. Don't even get me started. And now listening to the books, it's like it's like, why do these girls why are they still friends? I mean, I get why they're friends, but then they're so mean to each other. That's a whole nother, can't even get into it. Whew, okay. Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself closely watched by Miss Bingley. Oh, Miss Bingley. And that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. This observation would not have prevented her from trying to talk to the latter had they been seated at an inconvenient distance, but she was not sorry to be spared the necessity of saying much. Her own thoughts were employing her. She expected every moment that some of the gentlemen would enter the room. She feared that the master of the house might be amongst them. And whether she wished or feared it most, she could not scarcely determine. Wishing and fearing, fearing and wishing. After sitting in this manner a quarter of an hour without hearing Miss Bingley's voice, Elizabeth was roused by receiving from her a cold inquiry about the health of her family. Miss Bingley. She answered with equal indifference and brevity, and the others said no more. Conversation ender. My least favorite thing to be is just nobody wants to talk after you speak. Oh my God. The next variation with their visit afforded was produced by the entrance of servants with cold meat. She references cold meat a lot. Warm meat must have been like a dinner thing. Cold meat, cake and a variety of all the finest fruits in the season. A fruit of the loom, a cornucopia of food. But this did not take place till after many significant look and smile from Mrs. Annesley to Miss Darcy had been given, to remind her of her post. There was now employment for the whole party, for though they could not all talk, they could all eat. And the beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches soon collected them round the table. Whoa, a pyramid of food. While thus engaged, Elizabeth had a fair opportunity of deciding whether she most feared or wished for the appearance of Mr. Darcy by the feelings which prevailed on his entering the room, and then, though but a moment before she had believed her wishes to predominate, she began to regret that he came. She wished it really badly, and then he came, and she was like, oh no, what do I do? He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who, with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house, was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended to visit to Georgiana that morning. No sooner did he appear than Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly ease and unembarrassed. A resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, her and Mr. Darcy, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behaviour when he first came into the room. Ooh, suspense. Everybody's waiting to see what he does. Oh my gosh. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects. For jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk. She's also much more comfortable around him. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded as much as possible every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and in the imprudence of anger took the first opportunity of saying with sneering civility, oh my God, what is she going to say? Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the Blankshire militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family. Ugh. In Darcy's presence she dared not mention Wickham's name, but Elizabeth instantly comprehended that he was upmost in her thoughts, and the various recollections connected with him gave her a moment's distress. But exerting herself vigorously to repel the ill-natured attack, she presently answered the question in a tolerably detached tone. While she spoke, an involuntary glance showed her Darcy with a heightened complexion earnestly looking at her, and his sister overcome with confusion. Why are we talking about him? And unable to lift up her eyes. Had Miss Bingley known what pain she was then giving her beloved friend, she undoubtedly would have refrained from the hint, but she had merely intended to discompose Elizabeth by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and perhaps to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that Marine Corps. Coal. Not a syllable had ever reached her of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. So Miss Bingley doesn't even know that this elopement happened. She's walking into poop is what's happening. She's walking into something she doesn't even know about. She's not good. Points taken away for Miss Bingley, huh? Matchmaking points taken away from Miss Bingley. Not good. Had to plug in the old laptop real quick. Had Miss Bingley knows Elizabeth Bingley, but Miss Darcy Bingley, all the follies, not a spell of right. To no creature had it been revealed secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth, and from all Bingley's connections, her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it from their very wish, which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him, of their becoming hereafter her own. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect his endeavour to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. Elizabeth's collected behaviour, however, soon quieted his emotions, and as Miss Bingley, vexed and disappointed, dared not approach nearer to Wickham, Georgiana also discovered in time, though not enough to be able to speak any more. Her brother, whose eyes she feared to meet, scarcely recollected her interest in the affair, and the very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to have fixed them on her more and more cheerfully. Their visit did not continue long after the question and answer above mentioned. Cool. And while Mr. Darcy was attending them to their carriage, Miss Bingley was venting her feelings in criticisms on Elizabeth's person, behaviour, and dress. So Miss Bingley brought up a forbidden subject of Mr. Wickham. And now she's going to talk crap about Miss Bennet. But Georgiana would not join her, right? Nobody's going to join in with you on this smack talking against Elizabeth Bennet. Her brother's recommendation was enough to ensure her favour. His judgment could not err. And he had spoken in such terms of Elizabeth as to leave Georgiana without the power of finding her otherwise than lovely and amiable. When Darcy returned to the saloon, Miss Bingley could not help repeating to him some part of what she had been saying to his sister. "How very ill Miss Eliza Bennet looked this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She's grown so brown and coarse. Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again." However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned. No miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. "For my own part," she rejoined, "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliance, and her features are not all handsome. Her nose wants character, there is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which sometimes been called so fine, I could never see anything extraordinary in them. Can you believe this? They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all. And in their air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable." Oh my God! Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise. I did underline that last time I read this. I love that. Angry people are not always wise. Good to know, good to know. Good to remember. And in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from the determination of making him speak again, she continued, "I remember when we first met her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we were all to find that she was a reputed beauty, and I particularly recollect your saying one night after they had been dining at Netherfield, 'She a beauty! I should as soon call her mother a wit.' God, they're always just, I really do not like Mrs. Bennet. But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time." "Yes," replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer, "but that was only when I first saw her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of as the handsomest women of my acquaintance. Get over it." He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit as they returned, except what had particularly interested them both. The look and behavior of everybody that had seen were discussed. They had seen were discussed, except of the person who had mostly engaged their attention, Mr. Darcy. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit. Grapes. Did you see that pyramid of fruit? Of everything but himself. Yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece's beginning the subject. It's getting fun, it's getting juicy, it's getting a little catty. But we'll pause there and continue on next time with chapter 56 of Pride and Prejudice. Wow, no, 46. My bad. Wait. What? XLVI. What happened? Have I been saying these chapters wrong? No. Yeah, 46. I'm going cuckoo loco crazy. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening, and happy reading, everybody. Ta-ta for now. Bye.